Just be sure if you're to be sure about mics and cameras, just that you're aware, everyone, that we're now recording. Did you all get that pop up that it's recording now?
Yes.
Nice. Thank you. All right, so we made it through the first session. Well done. Awesome. Good work, guys. So we're now into session 2 of day 0. And I should say, just as a kind of intellectual kind of note, the naming convention that we've got here of like week -1, week 0, day day 1, stuff like that, that's really deliberate on our part. And it's because from a research point of view, I'm fascinated with the idea of 0. Like 0 is a really interesting, it takes a kind of whole kind of curious, elaborate, logical piece of work to come up with the notion of 0. When you think about it, 0 is the nothing that is. And that doesn't make sense. That's a paradox, right? 0 is something, is nothing that is something. And so just as a way of sparking that kind of discussion, we decided to name week 0, week 0. Also because it's the week before week 1. So that kind of made sense. And in computer science, if any of you are in computer science, a lot of programming languages, most in fact, count from 0. So the first thing in your list or whatever is number 0, rather than counting from 1, which is what most humans tend to do. All right, so now we're into session 2. This is where we have Dr. Alison Short and Dr. Stephen Healy speaking to us. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. They're going to do a little presentation, and a little bit like the last session, then we'll open it up for panel discussion. And the purpose of this session is to kind of further develop your kind of picture, your understanding, your thinking about what does research really look like? Like, what does a career in research look like? How do research projects take place? What we're really trying to do here for you is, in the kindest and most gentle way that we can, help dispel the myth and I guess disabuse you of the myth that this is a linear process, and that going in circles and taking unexpected paths, this is all a normal part of life. Well, it's a normal part of life, but it's a normal part of research as well. Sometimes I think we labor under the impression, the illusion, that research is just kind of this kind of neat linear trajectory that happens. You know, somebody starts out on a research project, they do everything, it all goes according to plan, and then they come up with their finding. And we want to help you understand that that's not normal. It happens every now and again, but it's not normal. Most of us have heaps of setbacks along the way. Things don't go to plan. Like I think Alexi said in the last session, most of the time you are sitting there thinking, I have no idea what's going on, and that's fine too. So I want to introduce Dr. Alison Short from the School of Humanities and Communication Arts, and from the Translational Health Research Institute. Do you have any other affiliations, Alison? You're with Marx as well?
Yes, Marx and the Centre for Educational Research.
Beautiful.
Also approved within the psychology discipline for supervising there too.
So a great example of somebody whose work kind of crosses out. And this is one of the odd things. We talked a little bit about discipline last hour, and that you will find yourself in a discipline, but often what happens when you actually start doing your research is you realize that your work crosses into lots of fields, lots of different fields, and that you have to use lots of different disciplinary kind of ways of doing things and methods. And we also have here Dr. Stephen Healy. Hey, Stephen. Stephen is in ICS, the Institute for Culture and Society, just like Declan. Are you across any other research institutes at the uni, Steve?
I'm affiliated with the School of Social Science as well.
School of Social Science, cool. So again, like most people who end up in a career in research end up kind of beyond a small niche. So I'll let each of our scholar colleagues introduce themselves by way of their own little kind of talk. We're going to have a little talk from each of them first, and then we'll open it up to a panel discussion again. So Alison, do you mind going first?
Be helpful if I unmute. No, that's fine.
Cool. And do you want to share screen or?
Yes, I will share screen, and I've sent you the slides so they can be shared later.
Awesome, thank you.
Just set up the shared screen. Just a moment.
I guess full disclosure, guys, I'm co-supervising a PhD project with Alison, a wonderful student called Lena Jeffrey, who's doing some really interesting research on meditative practices, I guess we would say, and
yes,
and sound.
Yes, I think we have a lot of connections in all sorts of different ways. Now, can you see this screen?
We can.
Right? Yes. Okay, so I decided to be a little bit playful with my presentation. So, you know, they talk about it takes a village. I thought it takes an orchestra because I'm a musical person. So it takes an orchestra to create a researcher is what I decided to call this. So I've already been introduced a little bit by Alex. So I'm the academic course advisor. So I'm basically in charge of the Master of Creative Music Therapy at Western Sydney. It's one of only 2 courses in Australia. And that's within the School of Humanities and Communication Arts. And as mentioned, I'm also affiliated with MRes, with the psychology discipline, with the Translational Health Research Institute, the Centre for Educational Research, and various other odds and ends. I'm also an adjunct senior lecturer in medicine, School of Medicine at UNSW.
Sorry to interrupt for a second, Alison. Could you put the presentation on presentation?
Sorry.
Make it
That's a bit
larger.
silly of me, isn't it?
Thank you.
All right, sorry about that. See, I'm out of touch. I've been on a weekend of quietness and forgot to do things right again. I also taught over summer, and so I'm just really tired. But anyway, so it takes an orchestra to create a researcher. So why an orchestra? Well, an orchestra has many themes, many voices, many refrains. And I think research contains many experiences and impulses and contracts and opportunities. And just as you were saying, Alex, I'd already said, not a straight line. And I think this is a theme that if you talk to any researcher, they might write it up as a straight line when they're writing an article or when they're writing the story of their life. But most people, I think, would say that there's all sorts of back and forth and you never quite know where it's going to be, even if it's generally in one direction or perhaps in a different direction you didn't expect. It's not a straight line. So I found a few little things here. No one can whistle a symphony. It takes an orchestra to play it. I thought that was quite nice. Obviously, it takes a village, which comes from the idea of it takes a village to raise a child. It takes an orchestra to raise a researcher is what I'm thinking. Also, you know, I think what's guided my stuff is no man is an island. So from John Donne, the idea is that we're all part of something bigger. If we just work by ourselves, we actually won't turn out to be a very good researcher in the longer term if we only just stick with our own little thing. So finding ways to work together is important. And there's a reference down the bottom there. I was honoured to be invited in to give my profile internationally about my life as a music therapist and researcher a little while ago. So what have I done? Well, I think of my life as, my research life as being in 3 phases. So the first phase, and I'm sorry there's quite a lot on this slide, but I wanted to capture it all together, so I'll just bring things in bit by bit. This is the slide that's probably death by PowerPoint animations, and if you survive this, you'll survive anything. So phase 1, health professional training. I trained in music therapy originally at the University of Melbourne and then later at New York University, and then I did some extra specialist training in something called guided imagery in music. I have all sorts of professional registrations and certifications both here and in America, and I've worked a lot with adult clients of all sorts. that was an important foundation for me in my life, and it's quite common in health professional training that people only come back to research a bit later on. They don't always go straight out of their first degree. Then my second life was when I decided to do a PhD for all sorts of reasons, not quite sure why at the time, but yeah, there were reasons. And then after that, I thought, well, actually, I really like being a researcher. I'd like to keep doing that. I was getting a little tired, weary of my own profession. And so then I reinvented myself as a healthcare researcher and looked at what skills I could transfer all over the place. I did 10 years as a health services researcher, mostly medicine, mostly linked to UNSW medicine, and also sometimes nursing, sometimes projects that were broadly in the community. Then I think of the third phase of my academic career, my research career, as being my full academic engagement. That's the last 7 years or so I've been at Western Sydney University. And even before that, I had taught in various places on a casual basis. So, senior lecturer at the moment, building knowledge, capacity, running a course, collaborative memberships, working with other people. And I became, through an expression of interest, I became the leader of the Music and Health Cluster, which sits within the Health and Wellbeing theme at Western Sydney. So what came out of all of these different things? Well, in the first phase, oh, sorry, you've got bouncy things now. In the first phase, I learned things related to research around reflective practice, critical thinking, noticing things along the way. Oh, that's interesting. I wonder what's going on there. At various stages, I was president and honorary life member, more recently honorary life member of the Australian Music Therapy Association. This was all about my professional life. Honorary life member of the Music Imagery Association. I did a lot of committee work, conference attendance, presentations. I was sort of pretty much expected to present. I was in the very first group of music therapy training in Australia, and we were told we were going to turn around and do presentations and write things. So I did, because I'm a good girl and I do what I'm told. Well, not so much anymore. And then I did a whole lot of casual and guest lecturing in various places sort of around the world, wherever I happened to be. Then my second phase with research training, obviously my PhD was part of my research training, and that was through nursing. There was no music therapy PhD or anything related to that in Sydney at the time, so I did it through nursing midwifery and health at UTS. So I learned then, once I had jobs as a researcher, and all manner of different jobs, I might say, nothing to do with music therapy. I learned to research collaboratively in a team, to write together for peer-reviewed journal publication. I learned to develop a broad network of researchers and clinician researchers that I came across in my everyday work, and I kept track of them, and I would send them things occasionally. Oh, you might be interested in this article that's just come out that I've seen. So I've kept track even from the early projects, and a lot of them were only 6 months, 12 months, 18-month projects, and sometimes more than one at a time. During that time, I was assisting others with research skills and figuring out what do they really need. Then in my what we'll call phase 3 full academic engagement, I've been a representative of the university on the Health and Arts Reference Group of the Southwestern Sydney Local Health District. I've been springboarding in all sorts of other new areas, depending who I meet with and the various ideas that come up and the various opportunities. I've been invited to do local and international research, more than I can actually handle. And right after this presentation, I'm meeting with some other people to see if I can get some help from somewhere. So I'm involved with groups in Denmark and Germany and America. And recently I've been asked to do some stuff in Mexico. So there we go. As part of being leader of the Music and Health Group, that cluster leader, we created over a long period of time. It was a bit of a challenge collaborating on that one. We created a white paper called Sounding Out, and I'll give you the link to that on the next page. I think it's on the next one or the one after. I've done all sorts of invited presentations in Australia and elsewhere, and for professional organisations, and more recently created a new MRes unit, Research into Practice. I'll tell you more about that in a moment too. So what sort of methodologies have I done? Well, it was a bit scattergun at first. I've done all sorts of different types of things, which is quite handy now at this phase of my life. But at the time, it was hard to see how it built together. So it was part of that zigzagging around, to end up with all sorts of different experiences. So I've done things with document review, and if you want to know more, I'll give you the references to these. But I've done things with document review, process evaluation of how a research project is done. I've done a whole lot of consumer survey stuff, especially in projects in Canberra. I've done clinical trials. I'm a bit of an expert on redback spider bite, believe it or not, which is really bizarre. And I've validated data collection instruments of all types, feasibility studies and mixed method studies, quantitative narrative, semiotic, qualitative narrative, semiotic, the semiotic work, especially from my PhD. I've ended up doing acoustic analysis. I'd never really anticipated doing that, but I've ended up in noise and music studies too, given the opportunities that arose. And most recently, I'm very interested in research case study approaches, especially paradigmatic and intrinsic cases in the new methodology that's been emerging in that area. So here we have the link to the white paper I'd mentioned, and within that we developed this continuum about how people use music for health. So here at one end you've got environmental uses of music. An individual can choose, a carer could choose for someone else, community arts workers could run choirs and things like that, trained volunteers, say in palliative care, other trained health professionals could use music, and then you could have a trained music therapist. And this has been helpful as a foundation in talking with people about research. So a lot of people think, oh, if I do some music, it must be music therapy because it makes me feel good. So it just delineates the different types of applications there could be. And within that, I've done a whole lot of different projects, as you can see there. So I encourage you to look at this website. It's quite useful and gives the whole white paper, which was, I think, useful. So everyone talks about impact, and no doubt there's been a bit of talk even now, or there will be more. So my noise and music project, the impact of that, I've been invited to conferences. I've ended up with more projects, student engineering projects, medical research projects, spread the methodology from one hospital to another. There's been international interest, and we're setting up an international network. We've presented together at conferences in Europe in those times that we could travel. Golly, I hope that comes back sometime. Importantly, contributions to healthcare guidelines. So my research in noise has been cited in the guidelines for the Australian College of Emergency Medicine about design in the emergency department, about guidelines for childbirth facilities, and some sort of Italian hospital guidelines. I'm not completely sure what that was, but anyway, it's been there. It's there. And there have been contributions to the new, there's always hospital redesign going on in New South Wales by the look of it. So some of it's contributed to that. Cardiac care, I've had invited book chapters, lectures and so forth. I've had a visiting scholar from China based on that, and some further projects with students. And then my work with interprofessional collaboration, which I've researched and written about. I've had further invitations to present both in Wollongong and in Toronto in Canada, and that was very helpful as a basis for the Sounding Out project, a white paper. And then this foundational knowledge has informed development of this new research into practice unit for Master of Research, which is open for enrolment, and it crosses the research clinician divide and the basic research and the applied research delineations. And we have a lot of vignettes from different people within that unit. It was offered for the first time last autumn, and we're going ahead again. So I'd like to say good luck on your own research journey, because I was trying to keep this very short. I was told to keep it short. Good luck on building your own symphony orchestra, or whatever you want to call it. And I saw this quote and I just loved it. I keep hearing it takes a village to raise a child. Do they just show up, or is there a number to call? And I think I'd like to say that about research. Do the research opportunities just turn up, or is there a number to call? Well, it'd be nice if there was a number to call. I'm not necessarily the number to call, but here's my research. Here's my contact details. And if you would like to contact me, you're welcome to. I was told in the last couple of days that the unit I just mentioned, for some reason, someone couldn't enrol in it. So if you're wanting to enrol in it, it doesn't work, contact me. and we'll figure something out. I have to investigate that today, what's going on. If you want to look more at the different metrics and things I've published, you see down the bottom here, Google Scholar Citations, there's a link to it, and ResearchGate, my profile there too, and you can find most of my publications on ResearchGate. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alison. Let's have a round of applause, yeah, for Alison. Thank you. One Payal has asked if your unit is available both semesters. I don't think it is it? It's just
no, just this semester, this autumn semester right now.
We might take some questions a bit later. Why don't we cross over to Stephen now and hear about his research journey.
All right.
We've got your presenter view for some reason.
Oh, okay. I will just switch display settings. No, shoot. Sorry about that. I'll just stop sharing and go again.
No worries. Lots of I don't know if you're looking at the chat, Alison, but lots of thanks coming in. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes. Well, lots of people do amazing things. I'm not the only one, but I just tried to put it together so that it could make sense. So the slides have been shared with you, Alex, so you can pass it on to other people if they want to.
Yeah, they'll be available on Views, everyone.
All right. There, I think that's a bit better, yes?
Yep, got it.
Okay. Thanks, Alex, very much for the opportunity to speak. And thanks, Alison, as well, for that really comprehensive overview of your research. I took a slightly different tact, which was that Alex asked me 3 questions, which is who am I, why am I here, and what am I doing? And he told me the time limit was 5 minutes. So I'm going to see if I actually can hit the brief in that sense. So as you can tell from my accent, I'm from the United States. By training, I'm an economic geographer, but I'm particularly interested in thinking about economics as a site of cultural practice. I got my PhD at the University of Massachusetts in 2006, so 15 years ago. And after that time, I taught at 3 different universities in the United States. Also during that time, I was collaborating with an Australian colleague, Catherine Gibson, who was a dear friend and collaborator of my mentor, Julie Graham, and we were working on a book project. And in 2011, I came to Australia to work on this book project, which was sort of a activism meets research approach to thinking about economic transformation. And at the end of that short fellowship, I met an Australian who then became my wife. So she moved over to the US and a job opened up at Western Sydney University. I applied and I moved to Australia in 2014. So I've been in country for 7 years. I'm speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Gurungai and Darug peoples. So what I have to say about that process is that moving countries and moving cultural contexts is a big deal. Even though the United States and Australia have a common history in many ways, it has been a huge adjustment. So my sympathies for anyone who is coming from somewhere else to take advantage of life here in Australia and to work together. That is something that I have found really challenging. So part of what's made that easier for me is that Catherine and I, along with some other faculty at Western Sydney University, including Declan, are all part of an international research network, the Community Economies Research Network, now the Community Economies Institute, an incorporated nonprofit. So the CERN network has 275 people in it, and they're academics, researchers, artists, and activists. And they're operating in 36 countries all around the world. And the common premise that unites the various projects, both artistic, action research, and activists, is that when we think about economy, oftentimes we're thinking about capitalism, wage labor, and the production of goods and services from markets. But from our perspective, that's only the tip of the economic iceberg. That if we think about economy as the production, exchange, and consumption of goods and services, a lot of that takes place in non-capitalist spaces and relationships. Much of what sustains us and the planet occurs outside of capitalism. And in order to take sight of the whole economy, that's the precondition for thinking about development differently. It's a precondition for thinking about social justice differently. It's a precondition for thinking about how we might respond to the challenges of the Anthropocene. And I'm really deeply gratified to belong to this network that's been operating for about 20 years now in various capacities, and to find common cause with people all around the world who are really interested and deeply passionate about processes of economic transformation. I'm thinking here of Silvia Federici's observation that one of the things that COVID has underscored is how all that social reproductive activity that takes place in households, that's largely the work of women, has been thrown into a new light in the context of the pandemic crisis, right? That this is a civilizational challenge. How do we value the whole economy and everybody in it in a way that sustains the planet? So that basic impulse informs all the research that I have done over the years. I'm just going to talk about current and pending projects. So along with a couple of other researchers at ICS and at UTS, I'm involved in a new discovery project, Innovative Waste Economies, Redrawing the Circular Economy, with 3 years of funding. The basic premise of the project is that in 2017, China said to the world, we're no longer going to act as your global recycler, and that precipitated a crisis, particularly in developed countries around the world, including Australia. And so the circular economy has become this new policy framework for imagining how economies can be closed loop in terms of their material use. It's sort of shiny and very technical. And in fact, there's a spot on one of the ABC programs this evening about it. But one of the worries that we have in this project is that actually there have been lots of cooperatives, collective efforts, and municipalities and citizen-based initiatives that have already been operating in this space for decades in Australia, thinking about all kinds of inventive ways of reusing materials, making things last, and repairing things. And the goal of this project is to document a vernacular version of the circular economy in the Australian context, to enlarge the number of people who can participate in a conversation about what circular economy should mean in this context and who's involved. A similar logic involves this other longer running project, Cooling the Commons, that involves about 8 different academic researchers across 3 institutions. And the basic premise there is that Australia is the hottest continent on the planet, and Sydney, particularly Western Sydney, is one of the hottest places on a regular basis. So the typical response to hot days is to close the door and turn on the air conditioning. The problem that we have with that is that option is not available to everybody. That privatized air conditioning is an inequitable response. And also it shuts us off from the possibility of living in a sociable, convivial urban environment. So the goal of the project here is to think more comprehensively about how we can work with nature, with land, with water, with wind, with flora and fauna, to develop more habitable urban spaces, how we can change social practices so that we can still have a social life, even when it's 35 degrees for months on end, which is the global projections. And it really foregrounds the question of social equity. How do we help people living with low incomes respond to the heat emergencies when they occur? And so central to this latest version of the project, which is a linkage project, we're hoping to find out this week if we get the funding, is we're working with about 5 different social housing providers to think about climate adaptive processes in the context of social housing. So both of those projects are actually part of a research cluster that's based at ICS, but it has links across the whole university called Urban Futures. The tagline for this group is identifying the conditions that make urban areas and regions flourish as spaces of inclusion, care, and justice. So those projects sit alongside others. My co-convener, Emma Power, is someone who's also really deeply committed to thinking about housing and welfare provisioning in the context of thinking about social justice in the long term and applied to spaces like Sydney and other cities throughout Australia, and in dialogue with other places around the world. So, I really see research as a process of conversation. I feel really committed to making sure that research includes and gives voice to people who are normally excluded from conversations about things that matter to them. And so for me, that's the point of doing this work. So my contact details, sorry, not quite as elaborate as Alison's You can find my publications on Google Scholar, of course, but if you want to find me in person, I'm in the South Campus of Parramatta, room G29. That's my extension. Happy to chat about my work, happy to chat about other people that I know and work that they're doing. I have one MRes student I'm working with right now who's working on the concept of panpsychism, which really blows my mind. It's been a fantastic collaboration. And I have another PhD student who came through the MRes program, and he's really interested in the ideas behind degrowth. So I suspect I probably went on a little bit longer than 5 minutes, but thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Stephen. Anna was saying earlier that she can't believe that this is her job, and I feel similar, because every semester I get to hear from colleagues around the university giving these presentations to our MRes students, and every time I'm kind of blown away by the amazing research that goes on at this institution. It's wonderful. Well, I think what we'll do now is open it up for discussion. Friends who've come into the MRes and RD1, feel free to ask questions either orally or on the chat. I'll keep an eye on the chat, and I guess I'll kick off. And I did have a little question that I made. I kept a couple of notes last night that I wanted to ask, but I think I might have lost them. But I guess the first thing that I'm perennially interested in this question, and I ask it of almost everyone who does these talks for us, and that is, in your position as people who supervise graduate students, as awkward as such a question is, like what's a top thing that you would recommend your graduate students do in terms of the processes of getting started on a research project from your perspective as a supervisor? I might throw to Alison first.
Okay, yes. Project planning.
And what does that mean?
Management. So having a sense of what comes first and what comes next and what is required. It doesn't have to be a full Gantt chart, but having a sense of what you have to do first and what the stages are within that, and breaking it down. It's very easy to get involved in a great big mountain, and you need to break it down into the steps that build towards that mountain. I think that's really important. And when I was first reinventing myself from being a music therapist doing lots of sing-alongs in aged care, as I was at the time, into becoming a researcher, and I looked at all of the jobs and was applying for jobs, and they all said project management skills. I thought, what's this? And I talked to a friend of mine who was very canny about these things, and she said, well, Alison, you're doing it. You have young children and you're getting one to the ballet with the right ballet costumes and fed at the right times, and the next one on to soccer, and back and forth, having all the right people at the right times with the right amount of equipment and food and everything else. That's project management. It doesn't have to be doing extra training, although I did go and do a bit extra training too. So it's that sense of breaking things down into pieces, figuring out what's necessary and relies on other things that stops you going on to the next spot, what can happen at the same time. So you can be writing your literature review and your methodology at the same time, things like that. So I would say the number one most important thing is think about, take a step back as well as a step in to think about what the planning has to be, and keep going back to that. Don't drive yourself crazy, but keep going back to that and figuring out, all right, so there's a delay on this, what else can I do? Obviously, people need to have a certain amount of time, intellect, commitment, and all those sorts of things, but I'd say project planning is an absolute must.
What about you? Thank you, Alison. And what about you, Stephen?
I kind of feel like Alison's stolen my thunder. I'm about to have a project planning meeting tomorrow with that new DP that I just mentioned, Discovery Projects, that is. And we're planning backwards from the endpoint. So what kind of outputs do we want from the project? What kind of impact do we want to make? So I think backcasting is another strategy for thinking about all those steps in project planning. Having watched all of my students, other PhD students, get affected by COVID, you know, like, we're not in control. And Alex, I think you were mentioning that right before I came on, that part of the reason why you plan is because there are all of these contingencies in the research process. The other thing I would say, and this is probably advice I should take myself, is that you have to keep reading, and keep reading things that inspire you. The inappropriate way of putting it is you can't shit if you don't eat, and then, like, intellectual input is food for us. So for me, like, that's what keeps me kind of engaged in thinking about the theoretical dimensions of the work that I do, is to feel like I have a context for like ongoing creative thinking and engagement. Last point, find a peer group. Peers are incredibly important for keeping you on track. Collective accountability, sharing drafts, any kind of collectivity that you can imagine, it's helpful. So for example, one of my students just recently turned me on to a software called Otter AI that does real in-time transcription over Zoom. So, you know, you no longer need to, if you're going to do interviews, you don't have to get them transcribed. There's an actual device that does that, that you can get on a subscription basis. So there's all kinds of innovations coming out that other people might be across, but you don't know unless you develop those relationships. So, I mean, to me, universities are collective, communal environments. They have that. That's their point of origin. So we should insist that they stay that way. COVID realities aside.
Yeah, word. Like we even refer to ourselves as colleges, and the idea of a college is it's a place where colleagues gather and work together. I think that's a really important note for us, and yeah, so much vitality and vibrancy and intellectual effervescence comes about because we get together as colleagues and are able to share information, but also challenge each other's assumptions and give each other insights and perspectives. And that's one of the magical things I think about the MRes, and particularly about the core units, because here in the core units, as you can see, everyone is here. Like, you're all here, and there are a huge number of disciplines and fields of research and ways of doing research present. We've got 82 people in the room, 4 staff, sorry, and the rest are all MRes students, each with a unique project, each with slightly different ways and sometimes vastly different ways of doing things. And those different ways of doing lend different perspectives, which is really important. I really encourage you, when Stephen, I saw Alison nodding vigorously as well, said, like, find a peer group, like, absolutely. And this room is one of the starting points for you. And I really encourage you to, you know, make friends and become peers with people in your field of research, in your discipline, but also people not in your field of research, in your discipline, because you'll find great value in hearing different perspectives on your work and hearing people talk about their work. I just want to throw, Sophie has asked a question of both of you, which is, could you talk a bit about the positives and negatives of doing research internationally? Sophie, do you mean in terms of going overseas, or do you mean in terms of collaboration?
Either side of them, just kind of your experience of working with international colleagues, or actually having that experience of going overseas, and the impact that has kind of had on your research experience.
I'm happy to chat about it, but I'm conscious I'm going first. So maybe Stephen wants to go first this time.
Yeah, I could do that if you like.
Since you're inherently international.
Yeah, well, all right. So I guess there's some practicalities, Sophie, that are worth considering. So right now I'm working on a book project with 4 colleagues in the United States about some research we did on something called the solidarity economy, which is sort of a social movement type effort. And, you know, that means that you're operating on a kind of like a 24-hour clock in terms of scheduling meetings. So there's logistical concerns that involve any kind of collaboration. COVID has amplified all of that stuff. Another project that comes to mind for me was one where we were some colleagues and I were looking at different community-based efforts in Korea, Colombia, and Finland to engage in economic transformation, ecological transformation. And it was funded by the Antipode Foundation. It was a great project, but it involved heaps of travel for 4 days of immersive interaction with artists and community groups. And when I landed in Colombia, they were a month into a ceasefire after 75 years of conflict. So thinking about what does economic justice mean in a space where there's been 3 generations worth of war, there's no way I can really get across that or do justice to it, but I can be really deeply affected by it, and I was. I actually find it difficult to write or talk about. So that's, depending on what kind of research you're talking about, there's some, I think, emotional risks that are associated with it. I have a number of colleagues who work in Cambodia, and that, there is a trauma 1 generation deep that affects the entire society. And that's, again, that's palpable when you're in that space.
And I guess from my own perspective too, Sophie, my stepfather used to say to me, whatever you do as an Australian, unfortunately, as somebody who comes from Australia, and whose life is likely to be played out in Australia, we have this strange obsession with overseas. And that my stepfather used to say to me, you've got to get the overseas certificate. Like, you've got to go overseas and do something, and then people will take you seriously. As if going overseas somehow made you like magically better at stuff. And I certainly found that in my career, that, as soon as I did a postdoc at the University of California, Davis, in the Center for Mind and Brain. I was a weird kind of fit there. I was a sociologist, but I was in a neuroscience lab doing, a long-term neuroscience project, still running. It's kind of 12 years more, 14 years of kind of project time. But as soon as that happened, I was suddenly taken more seriously for some reason. Part of it was because it was a postdoc, and that's a little tick. But part of it was because it was not in Australia. But also, I want to kind of touch on something that Stephen mentioned in his presentation, but also in his response, in that it's hard. If you go overseas, it's really hard. And like, I found the same. Like, going to the States was like, it was as if it was a different country. And it was a completely different culture. And we had, me and my wife and my kids, my daughter at the time was 1. We had massive culture shock going over there. And it was really, really difficult to do. I'm sure you had the same kind of experience, Alison.
Yes, I did actually. I lived around New York for 8 years. And that was before I was doing research. That was a coursework master's that I did there, and then continued on to have kids, which is another experience to do in America. So to manage the system there at the time. So yes, it was quite a change, because I thought, well, we see a lot of American stuff on TV. It can't be that different, but there are very different cultures. And there's a lot of similarities, there's a lot of differences, there's, good and bad, nice and not nice in every culture. And so you just learn to live with that. And we came back when the kids were quite young. Just picking up on some of the other things, I think from what Stephen was saying, I'd like to just say straight out, don't be colonial. don't feel that we're Australians and we know stuff and we're going to tell you how to do research. Or how to do your project, or how to live your life. So that's the first thing. I've worked, the people that I've worked with internationally have mostly been developed countries. It's been America and Europe. Language, just sheer language if you're going to collaborate with people. And I'll step back one point from even being international, collaboration. Someone once said to me, and I think it's true, the only thing that you lose by collaborating is time. So you have to factor in quite a lot of extra time when you're collaborating with people. They may be available, they might not be, something might happen, and you think about your life, something might happen that delays your plan, Well, multiply that by 10 people and you've got an awful lot of delays. So you need to figure your way through how best to work together and how best to manage together. But language, certainly. And so, you know, I was one of those Australians that was looking for where my family had come from in Europe, in Germany, and discovered it was former East Germany. They didn't speak English. And so I thought, well, I better learn German. And while I was there, it's like, oh, it'd be interesting to find out what music therapists and researchers are around there, and gradually made connections in that sort of way. And turns out I was invited then to work with the music therapy program in Heidelberg and in Hamburg at the universities there. So I've ended up, and then through that with people in Denmark too. But language, of course, most people speak quite good English, but practicing a little bit of my very poor German, well, they don't think it's too bad, but a bit of my German just shows that I'm trying anyway. And when I give a presentation there, I usually try and do a little bit in their language and then say, and that's all I can do now, I'm switching to English. So I think, you know, understanding the similarities and differences in the culture and the cultural understandings and whatever you're researching means for the people in that. And then, you know, just literally finding time for meetings. I've got colleagues in the UK and Switzerland I've been meeting with recently. Well, it either has to be late in the day, like 8 o'clock at night for me, or, you know, something, just literally getting time zones sorted out. An even more important thing for research is payment. So if you're going to get a grant with payment, that's a real problem. Well, not a problem, but you just have to look carefully at how the money gets distributed, because usually if you get money in Australia, they don't like you to send it overseas, and likewise overseas don't like it to send to us necessarily. So then you have to figure out ways that the money can fund this or that in different places. So it just becomes complicated, and you just need to talk about it carefully. With a number of all of my collaborations, I've met in person back in the time when we could travel, and developed a relationship first before we actually said, now let's do some more research together, let's do something else. And so they're quite long-standing relationships before I've actually worked together in research. Sometimes there's been, you know, hairy things about getting presentations together that they only do at the last minute, and you don't know them well enough to know if they're reliable and will actually turn up on the day with their part of the presentation. That's been a bit of a challenge. But and just choose the people you want to work with, and that goes for any research. Someone may be an excellent person in the field, but they may be really hard to work with, so try and do a little due diligence on that first, because you don't want to work with someone who either takes over your project, and I've had people try and do that, or just doesn't ever respond and just expects you to do every bit of the work. So you know, in a team, there's some that do more and some that do less, but just watch out for how that all works. And I guess I was already trained in group dynamics, so I was always watching that.
And on the topic of working together, Robert and Emma asked a good question. How do we do this? How do we get to know each other in the COVID times? We have limited capacity to get together physically. And Declan, I can see you're around still too, so if you want to jump on board, then feel free. But how do we, what's your advice on how can we come together as colleagues and get to know each other as colleagues and students and support each other when sometimes all we have is what we see in front of us right now, this kind of panel of faces and names on Zoom? What's your advice, guys? And by guys, I mean Alison and Stephen.
Oh, so I guess sometimes a handshake from someone else. So if there's someone you know working in the area and you say you want to actually find someone else in this area, like an email handshake sort of thing, an introduction is helpful. I don't know what's happening within this particular group, Alex, and how you're doing, but I imagine that there might be times when you break into breakout groups, or you might even make a drop-in time for people that they can start, you know, putting in the chat box what their field of interest is, and then maybe some groups can come out of that. Certainly within my music therapy teaching, within our cohort of 30 or, no, actually we've got about 47 students total now, that we do quite a lot of breakout groups and breakout rooms within that. But, you know, if you hear someone who interests you, follow up with them. I haven't met Stephen today, but I'm about to send him an email. Sorry, Stephen, to say hello. Haven't seen you before. Let's see whether, you know, one day we might work together on something, but at least we've made that contact. And likewise with Alex, I was looking for a supervisor for one of my students, had a look who was on the website, had a look through all of that and thought, well, I'll try Alex, let's meet together. And then we talked about whether, you know, he would do supervision and so on. So you just have to allow for making a first contact and then gradually developing more. It's not going to be an instant thing, but relationship is what it's all about, especially in COVID times. It's all about relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much I could add, other than to underscore, you know, I'm serious. I was quite serious in my effort and my invitation to anyone who might want to come and chat with me in a socially distant sort of way. I have met quite a few people at ICS and know folks at other institutions. So that is what makes the world work, is those interconnections and sort of chance encounters that then lead to somewhere else. So that's sort of the magic part of building relationships that can then lead to research opportunities, supervision opportunities, etc. The other thought that I had, though, really quickly, is that I've been on lots of Zoom meetings, and they're oftentimes very purpose-driven. And the problem I have with that is that you actually need to build in space for free-form conversation and association. That doesn't happen spontaneously. It doesn't even happen spontaneously in conferences, for example, right? It's, you know, you have to, the session ends, you go for coffee, and that's when the real interactions happen. So I don't, you know, I think we're in kind of new cultural territory in terms of how do we make room and space and even ritual practice to allow for those sorts of relationships to get built. I don't have any good answers, but I do know people who are actually studying this very question in the context of international governance, which is also, you know, all that has been affected by COVID as well. I'm really hoping that Australia will get its butt in gear around the vaccine and do better than America could do. You couldn't do any worse, really.
Yeah. Just one more comment about building groups and building things in your career. I grew up on a farm. I'm a bit of a gardener. And I often think in terms of working the ground and putting little seeds in, or just working the ground and see what happens. That, you know, all the little contacts you might have, and you might think, well, nothing's growing from that, nothing's growing from that. But you just keep on doing it. You meet people, you chat to them, you say, hey, we might have something in common, we might not. And you never know when something comes back to you sometime later. You don't know which seeds are going to grow, but you just keep throwing them around and working the ground, and then things grow. And I've ended up in looking at women's fertility in IVF, and I never planned to be looking at that. But it was a seed that grew from somewhere, from some contact somewhere, and then I followed up and that one grew. But there's other instances where people have come to me about something and I followed up and nothing really grew. It just went on the back burner for a while. But you never know, it might come again sometime in the future. So that's why it's not a straight path. But, you know, I often feel like I'm the one scattering lots of seeds, and some of them grow and some of them don't. And I just keep working the ground and see what will happen. And you just don't know. You know, you could call it fate, the hand of God, you could call it whatever it is. Who knows? But some things grow and some things don't. And, you know, that's the way I see research career. So you do what you can. You do the bits you can. If you're working on a particular project, you work on doing it well. You work on getting publications out. You work on being credible and all those types of things to be a good researcher, so that when people come to you, they see someone they want to work with too, not just you wanting to work with others. That's
on the topic of, I mean, something that both of you have signaled really strongly is that a lot of the work of research is relationships, relationships with other people, you know, either in the form of collaborations or just in the form of just as if it were something small. Having conversations with people, like one of the things that we'll talk about later in RD1, I think it'll be in about week 5. We'll talk about conferences a little bit. And one of my kind of, it's not a joke, it's a kind of serious claim that the main function of an academic conference is not to present work, it's to network with other people. We get together and we present work, but the main function of a conference is for colleagues to come together and to confer, speak together. And that understanding that element, and yeah, just letting it happen naturally is a real challenge, especially on Zoom. And Stephen, I agree that Zoom presents us, we miss all of those spontaneous, unplanned opportunities to just bump into people on Zoom. It is one of the reasons, RD1 colleagues, that Mondays for me are RD1 days. And I'll be at, when there is an RD1 class, I'll be at Parramatta City. And there is a class in the morning at Parramatta City on Mondays after this Monday. Or the Mondays that we're scheduled to have classes, and I'll be there all day. But even if you're not coming into campus, which is perfectly fine, I'll be on, like, I'll be available all day. I'm hoping we can get some kind of like Microsoft Teams or something like that set up, just to be able to have a free space in which to talk. And just on, as a last note, I suppose, just kind of meditating on the problem of you know, what I guess I would call bumping into each other in hallways, is that Western Sydney has a university that is one of the great challenges for us as a university, because we're distributed. We have many campuses, which means that one of the things that we often associate with universities, which is just bumping into each other in the hallways and, you know, having a conversation, learning something, you know, from somebody that you've never met before, in a completely different field. It doesn't happen in the same way. It doesn't happen in the same way at Western. Again, that's one of the reasons why I like RD1 and the MRes core units generally, is because they bring us together into a space, you know, where we can share ideas, where we can commune and confer, and where we can develop relationships. And we don't know where they're going to go. Like Alison said, they're the seeds, and it doesn't matter. We're not necessarily intending those relationships to go anywhere. We're humans, and we just want to relate to each other somehow. Anyway, that brings us to 12 o'clock. So a big thank you to Stephen and Alison for giving us their time, telling us about their careers and sharing their wisdom. Thank you so much, guys.
You're welcome.
And everyone, that brings us to lunch. One of the things I would say, prompted by Robert's question, usually in week 0, we would all be together on campus. And right now the university would be paying for sandwiches. So we'd be having sandwiches together, which is...
That.
Yeah. And we can't do that today. So that's a real shame. I always say that you can measure the how good an academic conference is by the quality of the food that's served at lunch. We try to serve good food usually. So hopefully later in the semester we can actually get together, all of us, including people from overseas. You know, hopefully the borders will be open and everyone can come to Australia, at least as many as Robert has prompted me to Uber everyone sandwiches. That's a terrific idea. I will have you know, colleagues, that I asked the Dean if I could do that and she said no. So sorry about that. But let's now go and have lunch. Alison and Stephen, thank you so much. I'll be back here on Zoom, everyone, at 12:30, where we can keep on eating our lunch for half an hour, and then we'll kick off again formally at 1 p.m. So see you then. Thanks all. Thanks, Stephen and Alison.